Is the third and final installment in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. It was released in 2007 and was directed by Sam Raimi. It starred Tobey Maguire, James Franco, Kirsten Dunst, Topher Grace, and Thomas Hayden Church. Once Peter's lives as Spider-Man and Peter Parker start to go well, he'll be forced to face many challenges caused by that, some external and others internal. This movie has taken on a reputation as the worst movie of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, and while I agree with that statement, I don't think it is as much worse than the other two as many people think. The first Spider-Man movie has a 90% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, and Spider-Man 2 has a 93% critic score, and the third movie has a mere 63% critic score and an even worse 51% audience score, both of which are low for the franchise. As I said before, Spider-Man 3 is my least favorite of the trilogy, but I don't think it is a bad movie. I'd even call it a good movie. I would even be willing to call it a great movie. Before I get into that, please remember to like and subscribe, and follow DM Reviews on Twitter. Link should be in the description. Also, don't forget to check out Demerit Commissions in the Discord server below for great thumbnails, profile pictures, phone backgrounds, and so much more. A warning, this video will contain spoilers for the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, since my goal with this review is to not get you to watch this movie, rather it's to hopefully help you gain a greater appreciation for this movie like I have. Firstly, I love Peter's arc in this movie because it was compelling, and more importantly, it seemed like the natural progression of the story for Peter. Peter Parker is a nerd, and basically nothing has gone right for him his entire life. Now that things are finally going his way, it is only natural that it would go to his head. Peter Parker is not a flawless human being, which the first two movies established, and this one continues that. This arc was also hinted at in the last movie. In Spider-Man 1 and 2, Peter rejects Mary Jane because he knew he couldn't be with her with his whole being, since he had the responsibility to be Spider-Man. And at the end of the second one, once MJ comes to Peter saying she doesn't care about that, instead of ending the movie with Peter triumphantly swinging, it ends with MJ watching him, now alone once again. Peter not being able to think about MJ was foreshadowed by that moment, so them doing this was not out of nowhere. It is clear this was the intention all along. This movie has a lot of villains. In my mind, it has 4. Peter, Sandman, Venom, and Harry. Peter is really the true villain of this movie. The themes of this movie are forgiveness and overcoming one's ego. Peter is the villain with both of these. He must overcome his own ego in order to save MJ, and he must allow himself to forgive Sandman for killing Uncle Ben. This was a great change of pace from the other two, where Peter was the protagonist, no argument about it, to where it is unclear if he is also the villain of the story. My favorite clear villain in this movie among the three is Sandman. Thomas Hayden Church brought a lot to the character. Easily one of my favorite moments in the entire movie is when he wakes up as Sand and has trouble holding the locket his daughter gave him. And I also love his line of, "I'm not a bad guy, I just have bad luck," which is why he's so sympathetic and why it isn't at all disappointing when Peter forgives him and lets him go. Harry is also a villain in this movie as the new Goblin, and he feels both out of place and underutilized, which is saying something considering I don't really like James Franco as his character. I thought that in each movie he got progressively better and more watchable, but he is still easily the worst and probably only bad casting decision in this trilogy. At the end of Spider-Man 2, Harry said he wouldn't avenge his dad, and the first time we see him since then, he is already trying to avenge him. I would have preferred he be the villain of a Spider-Man 4, and allow Sandman to be the villain of this one. I did, however, somewhat enjoy the amnesia story. It allowed for us to get a great scene where we see Peter and Harry as friends again, which made Harry's eventual death all the more heartbreaking. Everything else, though, from the amnesia plot, like the omelet-making scene, was bad and unnecessary. It has become very clear that the studio made Sam Raimi put Venom in this movie, while Sam Raimi had no interest in the character. This is what makes it all the more surprising that Venom really works in this movie, at least he did for me. Firstly, the symbiote is handled very well. Instead of using it to make a new story, or add like a separate plot line, it is used to enhance Peter's journey, like everything else in these movies. Right when Peter is at his most vulnerable and his angriest, the symbiote gives him an outlet for that anger. Eddie Brock is used brilliantly to show the viewer the road Peter Parker is headed down, and what he could be like if he loses his sense of sympathy and shame, and if he lets his ego grow any larger. Like the new Goblin, Venom also seemed crammed in, but he was also very useful at conveying the themes, and I definitely liked him more than the new Goblin. I also loved Topher Grace as Eddie. It is difficult to compare him to Tom Hardy's version of the character, since they are very different, but they both do a great job as the character and bring a lot to him. Like Harry, though, it would have been better if he was left out of this movie and was used in a Spider-Man 4. He could have then been the sole villain that Peter and Harry team up with at the end of that movie, and I think that would have been a lot better for well, what then would be a quadrilogy, and I think it would have just worked a lot better than cramming both of them into this movie. Though I would be okay with having both characters in this movie, just maybe you don't have their villainous turns till, maybe the very end, not the post-credit scene, but, maybe like the last scenes. The action in this movie is kind of a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, there are plenty of innovative action scenes, which I really liked. There were also many which were just two CGI bodies, falling down falling off a building, with, CGI faces put on them punching each other, and it didn't, grip me like other action scenes. This is very disappointing since the first two movies did a great job at making all of the action feel grounded, and didn't overly rely on CGI, and instead were an effective mix of practical effects and CG effects. Easily one of the most hated aspects of this movie is the dancing scenes where Peter is walking down the streets and, talking to women. I actually really like this scene. Once again, you have to remember that Peter Parker is a nerd. It makes total sense that this is what he thinks is cool, and once he has lost all sense of humility, and he feels like he's the center of the universe, this is exactly what he would do to look cool. One thing that really bothered me about this movie is that there are a lot of moments that are just really stupid. I feel like the writer just needed to have somebody tap them on the shoulder and say, "That's stupid." When Sandman falls into the sand pit, which scientists are doing experiments in, they say it's just a bird and will fly away when they turn the machine on. A few problems with this. Firstly, they didn't check, they must have known this was a possibility, that if somebody was in there, they could have, become a superpowered villain. Secondly, they didn't decide to check to just make sure. Why did they turn it on for so long? If it really is just a bird, turn it on for a second and then it will leave. This was a moment that meant so much for the story, and it seems like they didn't even think about it, which really disappoints me. All of the actors, newcomers, and franchise veterans, with the exception of James Franco, bring their A-game in this movie. J.K. Simmons once again proves why he, as J. Jonah Jameson, is one of the best casting decisions in any movie. Tobey Maguire is also really good in this movie, as he is in all the Spider-Man movies. It is really impressive how well he handled the 360 switch on the character from the last two, which must have been very difficult. James Franco really isn't bad in this movie, he's only the best he is in the franchise, just there were definitely some scenes where I wanted a bit more emotion from him, so that's really the only performance that at all disappointed me even a little bit. Easily my favorite scenes in this movie are the ones between Peter and Aunt May. They are filled with so much sincerity, and they are a great reminder of the good man that Peter is, and wants to be, even when he isn't acting like it. Like the rest of the franchise, this movie does a great job of building up the moment where Peter at the end of the movie puts on the suit, the red and blue one. Once he puts on the black suit, the movie does a great job of making you want to see him in the blue and red suit again. This makes it all the more climactic and satisfying what he does, and they'll do a great job of paying it off. Although I was not a fan of Harry in this movie, it was very satisfying to see him and Peter team up at the end. It is kind of the moment this trilogy has been building to, and although there were many parts of Harry's arc which were disappointing, this was not one of them. It probably would have been even more satisfying if there was a movie in between, this one, when he says that he won't avenge his father, which was at the end of the last one, and then when he decides he will, like at the end of Spider-Man 3, but it was still somewhat satisfying, but it would have been more if this whole thing happened at the end of Spider-Man 4, so we really got even more time to realize this villainous turn he was going down. I was, however, not a fan of MJ being the damsel in distress at the climax once again. It has happened multiple times in every movie, including this one, even before the climax, so doing it again just felt tired and worn out, and I felt like I knew what was going to happen, because we've seen this many times before. I kind of mentioned this before, but I love the moment where Peter forgives Flint Marko. It was very well done, and it retroactively makes a lot of scenes earliest in the movie better, since they have a satisfying finale conclusion. I also love that the final scene of the movie with Peter and MJ dancing. Although getting a fourth movie would be very interesting, I loved ending on such a sincere, heartwarming, and ambiguous note. Although another movie would be kind of interesting, I still really liked that they ended it here, and it's not at all like a dissatisfying final scene, which you can often see if you plan on making a sequel to a movie and you don't get it. So often it will feel like, oh man, I really want to know what's going to happen next. And while I do want to know what's happened next, this doesn't feel like I was cheated, how could you not give me another one? This is a very satisfying ending of the trilogy. That is why I believe that Spider-Man 3 is overhated and underappreciated. I'm going to give Spider-Man 3 a B+. Yes, it is worse than the other two, but it is not in any way a bad or dissatisfying finale to Sam Raimi's fantastic Spider-Man trilogy. Make sure to comment what you thought of Spider-Man 3 and what your personal rankings are of the Raimi trilogy.